Greetings to all and welcome. My name is Lori Weintraub, and I'm honored to serve as director of the Wagner College Holocaust Center and to be joining this talk with my class entitled Never Again, Empathy, Ethics, and Courage, co-taught by theater professor Teresa McCarthy with our first year students. It is my pleasure to welcome Annette Joseph-Gabriel, Assistant Professor of French and Francophone Studies at the University of Michigan. Her work offers groundbreaking new ways to think about intersections of gender and race in France and the Afro-Caribbean world, and the too often overlooked contributions of Black women. This talk is part of Wagner College Holocaust Center lecture series on heroines of the Holocaust and World War II, bringing to light some of the thousands of women of all faiths and races who fought the Nazis but have yet to be recognized for this work. We seek to highlight the courage and strategies of women like Vladka Mead, who smuggled a map of Treblinka out of the Warsaw Ghetto, of Friedel Dicker-Brandeis, who empowered hundreds of young girls to create art and maintain their dignity in terrorist concentration camps, of Nazli Allah, an Albanian Muslim who welcomed and hid Jewish families in their homes, one of over 13,000 righteous female Gentiles, and of Sophie Scholl, executed by the Nazis at age 22 for spreading the truth about Nazi wartime brutality. Today, we will be focusing on women in the French resistance and the Francophone world. Our class recently studied the Nazi massacres of 3,000 Senegalese soldiers among the 40,000 African soldiers who fought in World War II. Their heroism during the 1940 German invasion of France and the mistreatment in POW camps were quickly forgotten. And so I want to invite all of you to join us in June 16th of 2022 for our symposium on many aspects of this topic with scholars from 10 different nations. I now call upon one of the most celebrated women of Staten Island, Virginia Allen, to introduce Professor Joseph-Gabriel. In 1947, at the age of 16, Virginia Allen came to Staten Island. She began working as a nurse's aide in Seaview Hospital, the largest tuberculosis sanitarium in the world. Ms. Allen was one of the 300 Black nurses who cared for quarantined tuberculosis patients and provided direct patient care when white nurses refused. Known as the Black Angels, their history is the subject of a forthcoming book by Oprah Winfrey. Ms. Allen has served in many leadership roles in our community and most recently was recognized by the College of Staten Island with an honorary doctorate. I have invited her here to open with a few reflections on being a young and courageous Black woman during and after World War II. Virginia is one of my heroes. I now call upon Ms. Virginia Allen to introduce Dr. Joseph-Gabriel.
Thank you very much, Professor Weintraub. I'm going to remove my mask so that my speech is not muffled. I'd like to take a few minutes to reply to Professor Weintraub's request to introduce our esteemed speaker, Dr. Joseph-Gabriel. One of the women we are discussing today, Josephine Baker, was recently named as the first Black woman and only the 6th woman to be buried at the Pantheon in Paris, the highest honor in France. This reburial will be done November of this year, 2021. It was my pleasure and honor, and with fond memories, seeing Josephine Baker perform at Carnegie Hall in one of her final performances in America in 1973. When she finished her performance in her beautiful costume she strolled down among the attendees and had a connection with the persons who were there to a standing ovation for her homecoming. She once said, however, that she could dine with kings and queens and presidents of nations in Europe, but she could not get a cup of coffee in a hotel in America. And that made her real mad. What is a heroism? Heroism is a word that is often used in reference to courage of soldiers, firefighters, and more recently, the frontline heroes of the pandemic. What more can we do to make visible the contributions of Black heroines in history? I think of my mentor, and one of my mentors in particular, Sarah Tennessee Baker, who was a Black angel. She was a nurse, and she also served in World War II. As a Black nurse for over 50 years, I saw overlooked women behind the vital work at CVU Hospital, where tuberculosis drugs were developed that ended the epidemic. Not only doctors, but also nurses assisted in the medical trials and cared for patients, allowing for that success, of which I must say I am very proud to be a part of. Talks like this one today by Dr. Joseph-Gabriel and her larger research project on notable Black women have the power to remind us why this matters then and why it matters now. As long as young people are ignorant of this history, race issues cannot be resolved. We look forward to hearing from Professor Gabriel. She is the author of Reimagining Liberation, How Black Women Transformed Citizenship in the French Empire. Mrs. Joseph-Gabriel is on the front lines of reconstructing key questions about how Black women contributed to the fight against Nazism, and then how that experience empowered them to fight for more rights and freedoms. She is deeply concerned about how this history speaks to present-day struggles for the greater racial equality. She holds a BA in Comparative Literature from Williams College and a PhD in French with a graduate certificate in African American and Diaspora Studies from Vanderbilt University. Her research has been supported by awards. She is a recipient of the University of Arizona's Margaret T. Beale and Dennis T. Ray 5-star Faculty Award for excellence in undergraduate teaching in the Honors College. She has spoken in the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, the University of Ghana, and the University of Oxford, among other prestigious locations. We are proud to welcome her here today to Staten Island's Wagner College Holocaust Center, whose mission is to promote empathy, courage, and ethical thinking in order to combat racism, anti-Semitism, and prejudice in all its forms. Please join me in a warm, joyous welcome, Dr. Joseph-Gabriel.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful. Okay, so thank you so much, Professor Weintraub, for the invitation to be in conversation with all of you today. Thank you so very much, Miss Allen, for the introduction that you just gave. It is such an incredible honor. I could spend all day just kind of listening to you and to your memories and to thinking about this history and to learn from you. And so I'm really grateful and really honored to be in this space, to have had this introduction. And it's also such an honor to be in the presence of young people who are learning, as well as people from the community who have taken time to join us today. So really a sincere thank you to everyone for being here. So I'm gonna just kind of jump right into it because I really want to get to the Q&A conversation part. So what I want to do today is to give a brief overview of the actions of 4 Black women who took part in the French Resistance, who were active during World War II. I want to share a little bit of information with you about their lives, about what they did during the war. And then beyond that, in the post-war moment, how their experiences in the war sparked their political activism. And so essentially, I want to go beyond showing that, Black women did important and courageous things during World War II. That's certainly important, but I want to take that as a baseline. And I want to go beyond that to show how their wartime action influenced their refusal, right, of the different forms of prejudice and discrimination that Ms. Allen just mentioned, particularly their refusal of French colonialism and their vision for equality and political representation in France and beyond. And so the first woman that I want to talk about is Suzanne Cezaire. Suzanne Cezaire was born on the French Caribbean island of Martinique in 1915. She studied philosophy in France, and while she was there, she met and married the Martinican philosopher and writer Aimé Césaire. In 1939, with war looming on the horizon, the Césaires returned from France back to Martinique aboard the SS Bretagne. And I want you to hold the name of the ship in your mind because it's going to come back in another of our stories. So they arrived back on their home island of Martinique, and in a few short months, World War II would drastically change the political landscape on the island of their birth. The Nazi collaborationist Vichy regime in occupied France brought significant political changes to Martinique as well. So the collaborationist government that ruled France from 1940 to 1943 appointed colonial officials who were sympathetic to the oppressive draconian laws of Pétain's National Revolution. Now, it's important to remember that Martinique and Guadeloupe are vieilles colonies or were old colonies. And what that means is that they had had a long history of political representation in France, dating back to the 1848 abolition of slavery. And so when they fell under Vichy control, the Vichy High Commissioner to the French Antilles, Admiral Georges Robert, immediately shrunk and ultimately disappeared the limited freedoms that they had. So for example, Robert revoked universal male suffrage, and so men in Martinique could vote. They could no longer vote when they fell under Vichy regime. He replaced Black mayors with white Creole businessmen. And so white Creole businessmen were the descendants of the enslavers. So, all of the Black mayors were replaced with white descendants of enslavers. He also implemented new measures, increasing surveillance and curtailing movement. Anybody who dissented was punished with arbitrary detention and deportation. So when we think about the violence, right, that history of World War II, we have to also think about islands in the Caribbean that, are kind of stereotypically thought of as like just tourist destinations, and the suffering, right, that was present there as well in this moment of history. For many people on the island of Martinique, the new political climate in this wartime period, with its racial, social, and cultural oppression, really bore a startling resemblance to slavery. Any form of dissenting public expression was therefore a subversive political act. So this is the setting. It is into this setting of political repression that Suzanne Cezaire enters when she steps off the SS Bretagne and co-founds the journal Tropique. And it was in this context of truncated freedoms that she sharpened her skills of what she called literary evasion. That is basically the publication of subversive essays that she camouflaged as ethnographic studies. Eventually, however, Cezaire's cleverly disguised essays could not escape government censorship. And so the Vichy government's chief of information services, Lieutenant Vialle, ultimately banned Cezaire's co-founded journal, accusing its editors of being, I quote, racist, sectarians, and poisoners of souls, right? So they're publishing all of these essays denouncing fascism in this moment where such an act can earn you detention or deportation. And they've kind of like disguised these essays as like, super academic ethnographic studies, but ultimately it becomes clear, right, what their mission is, and they're banned because they're being called poisoners of souls. I want you to think in the present moment, right? The language that was used, and we'll look at that language just now, in banning that journal bears for me a startling resemblance to the language that is being used today in current attempts to ban what is being called critical race theory, right? The idea that it is divisive, that it is racist, that it is poisoning people's minds and souls. So I want to share with you the letter that Suzanne Cezaire wrote in response. I've broken all the PowerPoint rules because it's a humongous quote, but I wanted to give you the full letter because it is so powerful. Here's what she wrote in response to the ban of her journal. Sir, we have received your indictment of Tropique. Racist, sectarians, revolutionaries, ingrates and traitors to the country, poisoners of souls. None of these epithets really repulses us. Poisoners of souls, like Racine. Ingrates and traitors to our good country, like Zola. Revolutionaries, like the Hugo of Châtiment. Sectarians, passionately, like Rimbaud and Lautréamont. Racists, yes, of the racism of Toussaint Louverture, of Claude McKay and Langston Hughes against that of Drummond and Hitler. As to the rest of it, don't expect for us to plead our case, nor vain recriminations, nor discussion. We do not speak the same language. There's so much to say about Cezaire's response here, about her gesture of presenting French and Black Afro-diasporic writers and political figures, not in a hierarchy, but rather as a constellation of thinkers whose different strands of knowledge shape the composite vision of Tropique's anti-fascism, right? So if you look at the people she mentions here, right, you have all of the famous French writers like Racine, like Émile Zola, like Victor Hugo, and then she places them right alongside people like Claude McKay and Langston Hughes, right? There is no hierarchy here of, sort of superior white French thinkers, and then a kind of a racial hierarchy, which was the case in France at the time. But rather here, this constellation of thinkers who will shape this kind of composite communal notion of anti-fascism in response to the racism of Drummond and Hitler. But where I want to focus in what Suzanne Cezaire writes is the last sentence. We do not speak the same language. Think about all of the moments where you have had to respond to or challenge any form of prejudice or discrimination, right? Be it racism, anti-Semitism, etc., right? That in this moment, you have to kind of like respond to what the person is saying on their terms that diminishes one's humanity. What Suzanne Cezaire says here is, we don't even speak the same language. I refuse to respond on your terms. And so she takes the state's terms, racist, sectarians, revolutionaries, those accusations, and she redefines them as the starting point of her challenge to fascism. So if you ever get your hands on a copy of Tropique, and you can get those in the library, for example, they've been compiled and published, you have to read those essays not simply as essays written in the French language of the colonial empire, but rather in a reinvented language that expresses a vision for Black liberation in the Caribbean. To be Black, Caribbean, and French, particularly in this moment of oppression, is to exist at the intersection of multiple freedom struggles that include the Haitian Revolution, right? The reference to Toussaint Louverture, and creative influences that include also the Harlem Renaissance, to the references to Claude McKay and Langston Hughes. Remember, I asked you to hold in your mind the name of the ship that brought Aimé and Suzanne Cezaire to Martinique, where they co-founded this dissident journal. When Suzanne Cezaire stepped off the SS Bretagne onto Martinican soil in September 1939, she had no idea that the ocean liner's return voyage to France would be its last. Nor could she know that her compatriot and fellow writer, Paulette Nardal, would be aboard the vessel during its harrowing last days as one of the first casualties of World War II. So here I'm showing you a picture of Paulette Nardal. I chose a picture of Paulette with her sisters. So she's one of 7 sisters. The Nardal sisters in Martinique were writers and journalists and intellectuals and teachers. They worked and lived in Martinique and in France. And Paulette, the oldest, is the one who's standing, kind of looking directly at us in the photograph. Paulette Nardal was a writer, a journalist, an avid choral singer. So she had her own choir, and a soon-to-be English teacher who had been living for the last several years in France. She had returned home to Martinique to work on a tourist film at the request of the minister of the colonies, Georges Mandel. Fully expecting her stay on the island to be temporary, she had left her Paris apartment in the care of the building's concierge. 2 months later, she was still in Martinique, working on this film project when World War II broke out. Determined to return to her home, her life, and her work in Paris, Nardal secured passage aboard a banana carrier and arrived at the docks at Fort-de-France an hour before the scheduled departure, only to learn that the carrier had already left. Telegrams dispatched to Martinique were warning of German submarine attacks. The carrier's captain had thought it prudent not to linger. Nardal must therefore have been relieved to find space on the next departing ship, the SS Bretagne, that had brought the Cezaires home, and that was now making its return journey to France. On October 13, a month after her departure from Martinique, and with the ocean liner just 1 day away from the English coast, Nardal's relief turned to horror. The liner was torpedoed by the German submarine U-45. She would later recall the German guns hammering away at the section of the ship where the lifeboats reserved for women and children were stored. Nardal had to act quickly. 3 times she tried to grasp a knotted cord and attempt the daring maneuver of climbing down the side of the ship onto one of the lifeboats. 3 times she failed. Then there was a loud explosion, and she felt herself fall into the void and land knees first in a lifeboat. She lifted herself onto a bench and spent an agonizing 4 hours waiting for a rescue ship. Her injuries were so extensive that during the first days of her nearly year-long recovery at the city hospital in Plymouth, as German Luftwaffe bombs rained down on the city, medical personnel refused to send the telegram that Nardal had composed to her family in Martinique because they were convinced that she would not survive. I wrote a little bit about Nardal, her injuries, and the work that she went on to do after her recovery for what I thought was some obscure little blog somewhere on the internet. And a few days later, I received an email from a man I have never heard from before, and I have never heard from him since, although I have been emailing him constantly to give me more details. He sent me this photograph. He told me that his grandmother was a nurse in Plymouth during World War II. And he had read my article, and he remembered that going through her photographs, he found this photograph of Paulette Nardal that she had dedicated, she had autographed to his grandmother, Nurse Beryl Harris. Here's Paulette Nardal in that recovery bed where she stayed for a year recovering from this attack. And she's been visited here by the mayor of Plymouth and his wife. And in the inscription at the bottom, it says, "To Nurse Harris, in remembrance of those dreary days when her dedicated friendship and nursing brought me such relief. With love, Paulette." And this is from the City Hospital in Plymouth in 1940. So looking at letters like these, at images like these, hearing stories by Miss Allen, for example, having conversations like these, I find always so very amazing because we get to see, right, those connections that happened in this dark time, connections that might never have happened otherwise, right? That this nurse and this woman from Martinique crossed paths in this moment, and kindled this friendship. So now after all of this trauma, Nardal returned to Martinique with no possessions, no source of income, a terror of loud noises, and a permanent limp. She had to depend on her elderly father's meager income to survive, and she supplemented it by giving English classes to Martinican dissidents who were preparing to leave for neighboring English islands in the Caribbean, from where they would continue to Europe to join the French resistance. Nardal's wartime injuries put French citizenship to the test and quickly showed its limits. So here's what she did when she got back to Martinique. She wrote to the governor of Martinique. Remember, at the time, it's a colony, so he's a colonial administrator. His name was Georges Louis Ponton. She wrote to him requesting disability benefits and compensation for her losses as a French citizen who had been injured while undertaking cultural work for France. Remember, she was returning to France on the ship after having worked in Martinique for 2 months on this film for the French government. It took 2 years for Nardal's request to Ponton for disability benefits due to her war injuries to wend its way through the interminable French bureaucratic process. In that time, Ponton died. His successor, Georges Parisot, took charge of the dossier. As the war raged on and letters and telegrams shuttled back and forth between the governor's office in Fort-de-France and the colonial commission in Algiers, Nardal waited for news, depending only on her father to survive. The blow came in 1945 in a telegram from Algiers. Nardal was not eligible for compensation because there was no legislation that recognized civilian casualties in colonies that had not suffered direct damage, was the quote I found in the archives, in the war. Her claim to indemnity as a war victim had been denied, and with it, all the contributions that Martinique had made to the war effort. The island's distance from Europe meant erasure of the very real losses that its people had suffered, expressed here in the language of a supposed absence of direct damage. Unlike Suzanne Cezaire, who wrote an incendiary letter denouncing fascism, Paulette Nardal doesn't come across in this story as having done anything heroic. She's rather the victim of a German attack. So why do I include her? Well, her experience of trauma sharpened her resolve to advocate for full citizenship rights for Martinican women. In an editorial she wrote, titled Martinican Women and Politics, Nardal argued, I'm going to show you the quote here of what she wrote. She argued that Martinique should draw attention to itself through the importance of female participation in decisive elections. We must present the true face of Martinique, this time to France and to the world. Remember, women in France gave the vote in 1944, right? And so this is the moment, Nardal says, where Martinican women also are not just somehow secondary, far away from France, and therefore not important in that history. That's what happened to her, right? When they said she could not get benefits because there was no direct damage to the island in the war. She says here, we must present the true face of this island to France and to the world. In order, she continues, to better clarify our choice, we thus have the duty to inform ourselves about social questions and involve ourselves in deep reflection based on knowledge of ourselves and observations of reality, right? And Nardal's call to inform oneself and to have knowledge of ourselves based on observation and reality, I think is so crucial still today. So what Nardal argues here is that women's political participation goes beyond the single act of casting a vote. It also involves a collective self-consciousness cultivated by knowledge of the political, social, and economic realities on the island. Facing intersecting oppressions as Black women colonized subjects, Martinican women's contributions to political life for Paulette Nardal is what would bring about a more democratic post-war France. When World War II broke out, Suzanne Cezaire wrote essays denouncing fascism. Paulette Nardal challenged the colonial policies that excluded Martinican war victims from disability benefits. Far from the Caribbean, in Central Africa, another Black woman also challenged fascism by working behind the scenes to free her children from occupied France. Born in French Guiana on November 23, 1891, Eugénie Éboué-Tell is often known as the wife of Félix Éboué. And I've selected this family photograph here, right? So you can see her with her husband, Félix Éboué, and then on the right is her daughter, Jeanette, who was also the first wife of Léopold Sédar Senghor, the first president of Senegal. But Éboué-Tell was more than just the wife of a high-ranking colonial official, right? Both Félix and Eugénie Éboué-Tell were one of the first colonial kind of administrators to respond yes to Charles de Gaulle's rallying call to form the Free French Forces, the French Resistance. She publicly supported Charles de Gaulle. She joined the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and served as a nurse at a military hospital in the French Congo between 1941 and 1944. And the story that Ms. Allen shared, as well as the example of Nurse Harris and Paulette Nardal, shows us the crucial role that nurses played, right, in this moment, in the war period. Because of her efforts for the French resistance, the Vichy government in France condemned her to death in absentia because she was living far away from France, and they seized her home in France and all her belongings. Her children were held hostage in occupied France, including her sons Robert and Henri, who were held in a prisoner of war camp. After the war, Éboué-Tell's wartime service and her later political work earned her at least 26 medals of recognition in France, Ivory Coast, and other countries. Her citations include 3 of France's highest honors, a Médaille de la Résistance, a Croix de Guerre avec Palme, and a Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur. So how did her wartime experience serve as a stepping stone for anti-colonial activism? She did 2 things. She ran for office. So first, she became the first Black woman elected to the Constituent National Assembly. Translated into English, that means she was the first Black woman in the French Parliament. After a year there, she ran again for elections and was elected to the French Senate, becoming one of the first Black women senators in France. I want to share with you a quote that she wrote and that she said actually in a speech during her electoral campaign. She said, "For the first time, women have been called upon in France to enjoy the same electoral rights as men. If there are some women who ascend the steps of the Palais Bourbon is basically the seat of the French Senate, right? So if there are women who climb up those steps into the Senate, they must, by their work, carriage, and dignity, show that they have long been ready to take up these duties." What I want to highlight for you is the last thing she says. They have long been ready to take up these duties, right? That these rights, these equal rights that French women were seeing now in 1944 were rights that they had earned long before the French government finally decided to make it a reality. What Éboué-Tell did in her time in the Senate was to collaborate with other women who were also active during the war. For example, she collaborated with Gilberte Brossolette, who was a clandestine courier during the war, who relayed information between London and Paris for the French resistance. She, like Éboué-Tell, also earned France's highest military honors for her role in the French resistance. And so by collaborating with women like these on her petitions, on the legislation that she pushed through in the Senate, Éboué-Tell showed that women's participation in the resistance was a platform from which to come together to collaborate and to demand full recognition as citizens of France and to advocate for women's increased access to politics, education, employment, and state protection. Women, she said, have long been ready. In addition to women like Brossolette, Éboué-Tell also collaborated on several laws with the only other Black woman in the Senate, Jeanne Vialle. I'm going to go a little bit quickly through Jeanne Vialle's kind of biography. She's really fascinating though, but I want us to kind of get to Josephine Baker and then get to Q&A and have a bit of a conversation. Now, Jeanne Vialle essentially also worked for the French resistance as a clandestine agent. She was arrested in 1943 by Vichy police interrogators who, when they interrogated her, found that she handled large amounts of sensitive information that was expertly categorized and coded in language that Vichy police could not decipher. So Vialle was working as this clandestine agent in the south of France in Marseille. What you see on the screen here is this long list that I took in the archives of everything they found in her possession when she was interrogated. They found copies of information about train schedules. She had information about who were undercover Vichy police officers. She also had information about Charles de Gaulle, copies of his speeches, right? So she had all of this like really sensitive information. And every time, and the reason why we have this full list is that her boss, who was the head of one of the three resistance movements in the south of France, Combat, when he was interrogated, gave up all this information. When Vialle was interrogated, she only said one sentence over and over again: "I wish to speak in the presence of my lawyer." Eventually, she was interned for 4 months in the Brent women's concentration camp. And then she was transferred to the Beaumet women's prison in Marseille until December 1943. According to some government accounts, she then broke out of prison and went underground. And I'm still kind of like waiting for the Netflix like film of her life, right? But like when I read through the archives, Jeanne Vialle's records are today the only accounts that I have been able to find of a Black French woman in a concentration camp during World War II. The documents and accounts about her interrogation and trial remain sealed, and you can only get them by special permission to the French government. And so I'm showing you here the letter that I got from the French government saying, here you now have the right to go see these documents. You're not allowed to take pictures. So that's why I took that kind of hasty picture that you saw there. And also that I'm not allowed to use any of the information that I find to tarnish the reputation of France. Even then in 2014, right, this memory, this history is still really crucial for the French government in our present moment. Vialle went underground and then resurfaced suddenly, like Ebuytel, ran for elections and became one of the first Black women in the French Senate. I'm going to share with you a quote that she wrote that shows the way that her experience of trauma in a concentration camp, in prison, being interrogated, all of those things informed her vision for equality for Black people in the French, kind of the French Empire afterwards. So she wrote, right, this is the founding principles of an association that she founded. She said, the women who experienced the torture of prisons, the horror of concentration camps, the life of the hunted, and who for many years trembled in fear for their parents, their friends, their work colleagues, wanted to bring together in this association all the women of overseas France in the spirit of fraternity to work towards the same goal, to allow all women to establish honorable and happy homes in a peaceful atmosphere. And so here in this kind of image of post-war, right, peace and rebuilding, Vialle is emphasizing, like all the women I've shown before, A, the role that women have to play and that it's a crucial role, and B, the fact that those experiences of trauma in the war informs their vision and their desire for a better and more equal France. So what does this all mean for us today? In my mind, these Black women's visions for equal citizenship on their terms, rather than on the state's discriminatory terms, have not yet come to pass. And Josephine Baker is an example of that. So I'm gonna kind of fast forward here a little bit, right? So, you know, as Ms. Allen said, right, last month, the French government announced its decision to honor Josephine Baker with a Pantheon burial. It is an honor that is conferred on only a select few of France's national heroes. And Baker, like Ms. Allen said, will be the first Black woman buried in the Pantheon. What is the meaning of this gesture? We have to place it in a continuum of recent political events in France. So first we have last summer, mass protests in France against racism and police brutality, in the wake of George Floyd's murder in the United States, right? So it echoed, and you had mass protests in France as well, followed by the French government's complaints that academics in France were importing an American discourse of race that is not applicable to Universalist France. And then we have the announcement that Josephine Baker is going to be the first Black woman buried in the Pantheon. And finally, in a few months next year, we have the upcoming French presidential election. But we also have to place the choice of Josephine Baker in a continuum of historical events that have long preceded last year's protests and today. According to the narrative, and I've highlighted some moments for you here in French, and I'll translate them into English. According to the narrative from the Élysée, right, so the seat of government, Josephine Baker incarnates the spirit of la France éternelle des Lumières universelles, eternal France of the universal enlightenment, because she participated in the struggles that unite French citizens, namely the French resistance and anti-racism. But what we have to understand is that, yes, she was committed to these struggles, but what is really convenient for the French government in choosing Baker and not, for example, Suzanne Cezaire or Paulette Nardal or Eugénie Éboué-Tell as the first Black woman buried in the Pantheon is that she can be made to embody a story that the French state has long told, which is that the African-American intellectuals and performers who moved to Paris in search of refuge from Jim Crow in the interwar years are evidence that France has always been a country of equality. Because in France, Josephine Baker could go from the rags to riches American story that she could not attain in the United States. This is proof, according to France, that France is not a racist country. But there's so much in this story that is unspoken. And what is unspoken, I hope, is what you have heard these four women say in my presentation, that they have spoken into that void. The first and obvious fact is that because Baker is both American and French, recognizing her allows France to acknowledge Blackness while sidestepping its own colonial history, and therefore, ironically, sidestepping the contemporary legacy of that history that this gesture is supposed to address. In the government's narrative today, there is no need to acknowledge that navigating 1930s and 1940s France as an American woman was quite different than doing so as a woman from Martinique or the Congo. So when we look at Josephine Baker, not at the image of Josephine Baker that the French government has chosen to repurpose, but rather at the honest image of Baker herself, Baker in all her dimensions, here in this photograph as a war hero, but also as a dancer and a performer who donned this banana skirt, right? In order to kind of appeal to the French colonial desire to consume all things exotic and primitive. We have to ask two questions. What did French citizenship mean to Josephine Baker? But perhaps more interestingly, what does Josephine Baker's life and work do to the definition of French citizenship? Just like the other four women I've shared information about today, if we look honestly at Baker's life, her work, her statements, her writings, we notice that she too challenges the French government's narrative of citizenship and reimagines it in her own way. How does her banana skirt dance rewrite the script of France's national narrative by showing and laying bare the price of admittance for a Black woman into Frenchness? These are the questions that I hope that we can discuss, and these are the questions that I hope will be at the forefront of public conversations between now and when Josephine Baker is buried in the Pantheon on November 30th. The four Black women I have talked about here use the traumatic experiences of wartime as a starting point to imagine a better world for Black women in the French Republic. They did not just advocate for inclusion, for the crumbs of empire, but rather for a dismantling of the exclusionary ideas about citizenship that would unmake and remake the empire into a more democratic union. So I'm gonna stop here. Thank you all so much for your attention, and I'm so eager to hear your thoughts and your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Joseph-Gabriel. Those are such incredibly important questions. You guys hear me? About about this goal to dismantle the exclusionary definition of citizenship and how much more we have to go to attain that actual dismantling, despite so many years that have passed. And I wanted to mention two things and open it up for questions. One, I wanted to ask your opinion about why Eugenie Éboué-Tell is not interned with her husband. If you could tell us why was he chosen as the first Black man to be entered, I believe, in the Pantheon? And it seems so logical. Marie Curie got into the Pantheon initially along with her husband. Why weren't they honored as a couple? I don't know if there's an answer to that, but that's one of the questions that I had. And then I just also wanted to say that quote by Jean-Viele about the torture of prisons is definitely something I would like everybody to know. That quote is so beautiful about how you can turn the tragedy of being in a concentration camp to a vision of, humanity and progress is just incredible to me. So if you wanted to comment on either of those things, and then we can open it up to other questions.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly. So, Felix, that's the thing, right? Is that, okay, Josephine Baker is going to the Pantheon as a response. It's a political response always, choosing who goes to the Pantheon. What is happening in the present moment, right? And then they choose who's going to go basically as a gesture to respond to what's happening in the present moment. So that's why Baker is going today. Felix Éboué died in 1944. And remember, he was one of the first French kind of officials to respond yes to Charles de Gaulle's call, the rallying call for the Free French Forces. So in the year when he died, right, there was that need to memorialize, right, somebody who represents the French resistance and not the darker side of France that France didn't want to remember anymore, which is the collaborative side of France. And so that's why Felix Éboué goes. Eugenie Éboué-Tell lives quite a bit after her husband, right? So she's active in politics until I want to say about the 50s and dies, I think, in the 70s. By then, nobody really remembers her. If she had died in 1944, in that moment where they needed a political symbol, she would have gone with him, I imagine, right? To show that France is all, who gets buried is always to show who France wants to say that it is, right? The image of France that the nation wants to project. And so at that time, Felix Éboué represented that. But by the 1970s, nobody's really thinking about Black women. Nobody's really thinking about, about Black people at all, really, at least not as a response to anything political. And so, by then her memory is forgotten. And so Eugenie Éboué-Tell is actually forgotten for a really, really long time. And it's only, in more recent years that people have started to do some work to go back and think about her monumental contributions to French politics, and to all of these discussions about race and racism. And then, yeah, I absolutely share your enthusiasm about Jean-Vialle's quote. It's such a beautiful and amazing quote. And, it always makes me wonder, what did she do in those years where she went underground, right? Like what happens in that turning point from the torture of prisons and concentration camps to the triumphant moment of, entering the French Senate? What is the work that is done, that needs to be done, of self-reflection, of community building that allows for that transition, to move from the horror to the victory and triumph?
Thank you so much. I think we have about 10, 12, 15 minutes for questions. So I'll start with the students, and then after that, if somebody on Zoom wants to ask a question, actually, I think the best way if you're on Zoom is if you put your question in the chat and I will read it. So we don't have to keep unmuting. So I have two students with questions. Let's see if you can hear them if they just ask from their seats. Derek, you want to go first?
I have a question about how you said that it shows that the country of France is has always shown equality. Do you specifically reference that, like exact situation for that country, or do you think every other country who could possibly do the same thing would always show that they've also been people of equality, that country has been of equality.
Okay, so I'm hearing part of the question. When you say the quote that talks about showing that France has been a country of equality, do you mean, do I believe that France has always been that, or that is France only that sometimes?
Is France only that sometimes?
And I hear your question also, you're saying, based on studying France, what do you think the lessons are for the United States? Is that a little bit what you're asking as well? Like, you know, what are the lessons of this kind of approach to race compared to like what you might recommend in the United States or see in the
Right. Yeah, it's such a great question. And it's a question that's being debated still today, right? I think that, so I think the image that the French government wants to portray is that France is a country of equality, has always been. So remember, France has that three-part motto, right? Liberty, equality, fraternity, and that it has always lived up to that. And they always hold African Americans in France in the 20s and 30s as evidence of that. You know, like, look at all these people. Langston Hughes was here, and Josephine Baker, and Ada Bricktop Paris, and Sidney Bechet, and Eugene Bullard, and they opened these jazz clubs, and it was fantastic. They were escaping Jim Crow in the United States. The United States is a racist country, France is not, right? But when you study them together, you see that it's not that simple, that there's so much that is actually held in common, because all of these women are challenging the very ideas that we see both in France and the United States of white supremacy. It just looks different, right? It's a different face, but it's the same underlying idea. So yeah, France and the US certainly have different approaches to looking at race, acknowledging racism. But I think that both of them have great examples of working towards equality. And both countries also have a long way to go. So one of the lessons I think that the United States maybe can learn from France, right, is certainly to go back to that moment. What is it that made the 20s and 30s in France such a great time for Black people to be there, to thrive, to attain wealth the way Josephine Baker did, right? Sometimes I take my students, when study abroad was possible, I would take my students to Josephine Baker's chateau. Like, she lived in a castle, guys. Like, it wasn't just a big house, she lived in a castle. She attained this dream that she couldn't attain in the United States. But at the same time, we also have to understand what changed. What is it that makes France not still quite living up to the dream that Baker herself had for France, that these women had for France? And in what ways can the United States also learn, right, from the successes and the mistakes of France? So, you know, I think that having a comparative approach, like you're asking the question, is really important, because it helps us to take away lessons about what was possible in the past and how we can make that possible again in the present.
I'm just going to ask a quick follow-up and then the next student. Do you think that the reburial of Baker in France will have an impact in the United States in terms of actually grappling with the fact that she was so unwelcome here, that there was so much racism here before she came to France? Or you think it will just not go noticed in the United States?
That's a really, really great question. So I think it will go noticed to some degree, right? So one of the slides I had for you all had that broke the story was the New York Times, right? So it's garnered some attention here. I think that France would like for the message that this gesture sends to be, hey, United States, take a closer look at yourself and at your racism, because, right, like, look at Josephine Baker, who could only become this person that she became here in France and not in the US. But at the same time, remember, one of the slides I showed you was the protests in Paris against police brutality, right? Is that what I would hope is that Baker going to the Pantheon would be a moment for inward reflection, both for France and for the United States, right? Certainly for the United States to think about why is it that people couldn't attain that famous American dream here, right? The reality of racism. And that my hope would be that example would challenge the current, attempts to ban any kind of, attempts to study this history by saying, well, we have to ban critical race theory because, I didn't really know the reasons why, right? Is that we can say, well, what if we look at this past honestly not as a moment of like, extreme guilt, etc., but as a learning moment. So what can we learn for the present? But I do think it'll garner some attention in the US. I already saw the story broken, in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And then of course, there's a whole bunch of like, US based academics who are like nerding out over this because we're like, oh my goodness, we want to be there to witness this historic moment, right? So I think that, it'll open some conversation, and I hope that it'll be a productive conversation as opposed to a defensive conversation.
Great. Okay, two students, Amanda and then Cassidy.
So, my question.
Just speak loud because I think it's hard for her to hear.
So, I just wanted a re-clarification, about so you said that Eugenie Éboué-Tell, wasn't, buried in the pancakes, sorry.
That's okay.
Wasn't buried along with her husband in the Pantheon, but was the reason why because she outlived him, or like?
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? So because she outlived him, by the time she died, France was no longer in need of any kind of symbol, of anything that she would have symbolized by burying her in the Pantheon, right? The first woman to be buried in the Pantheon was Simone Veil, right? She was buried like, I want to say like 2 or 3 years ago. So it's super recent to even have women in the Pantheon in the first place, right? So yeah, it's because she outlived him. By the time she died, her political legacy wasn't really recognized or important to the French state, right? And it's only now that we're trying to say, well, hey, look at this woman too, because she was just as important as her husband. Maybe if she had died in 1944, when France wanted to show more symbols of the resistance, to say, hey, look, we're the good France, we're not that France that collaborated with the Nazi collaborations Vichy regime, then maybe she would have also been buried there. But that's my hypothesis for why she hasn't been buried there.
Thank you. Okay,
Sorry.
one more question. Yeah.
So you touched on it a bit when you were showing the pictures of the protests in France after the killing of George Floyd, but I was just wondering like how influential you think that storytelling, like through the families of those 4 women, like carrying down into the future, like how influential it is to people in France right now, as far as like, because racism is still present everywhere, so like how is that?
Okay, so how important is storytelling for, is that the question for kind of combating?
As far as like the families of those 4 women, like it being carried down like through generations, their importance.
And if I could just add to that, the question that came up in our last class was, why don't we know these stories? Why haven't we heard these stories before? So I think, is that what you're trying to say a little bit, Cassidy? Like, what's the impact of telling the stories within families, and what's the
like carried over to today?
Yeah, and why hasn't it happened sooner? Why haven't we heard these stories sooner? Is that what you mean? Okay, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, so I hear a 2-part question. So, I mean, storytelling is so crucial, right? Like for the families know these stories, right? They have the pictures, they have the family memories, they have, the stories that are passed down orally. So the families know these stories. And I think what's important for them is, sharing these stories, having these stories known so that they can impact, right? Like the broader conversation around race and racism and gender discrimination in France, right? So if you look on the internet, for example, there's a petition, there's a whole website, like with a committee and everything. There's a whole association dedicated to petitioning the French government to have Eugenie Éboué-Tell buried in the Pantheon, right, as an act of remembrance. So, like and it begins with a small group of people from the Caribbean who are pushing for this. And so, the families, they know these stories and they hold them close. And I think that there are stories that are really important to them. Why do we not know more about these women? You know what? I gave a talk on Monday, and a French person who grew up in France asked me exactly the same question. She was like, I grew up in France, I have no idea who these people are. Why don't I know? I was like, I don't know why you don't know. Like, but it's the question, right? is who do we choose to remember? Who and what we remember is really less about the past and more about our moment in the present and the image of ourselves that we want to project into the future. And up until now, people haven't really cared, or some people haven't really cared too much because they haven't really had to grapple with questions of race and racism in the French context, at least not in a spectacular, in a national way, as they did last summer with those protests, as they did in 2005, right, with those famous protests in France, right? So it's in those explosive moments that we turn back to the past. And then when things feel okay, we don't really tend to remember these moments. And that's maybe why we don't remember them as much. And then also because we tend to focus on men, right, like masculine heroes and stories, these women also get sidelined. So those are, I think, the two reasons why.
I have one more question, and there's an audience chat question. So Josephine Baker's third husband was Jewish, and I was wondering if it's possible, like if any of these other women had any sort of Black Jewish alliance in France, or if you think that that is in any way going to be part of the commemoration of Josephine Baker. Is that aspect of her life, you know, her direct relationship with somebody who's Jewish, going to come up in this process of memorializing her?
My gosh, that is such an important question. And I really don't know the answer to that. I don't quite know in what direction you know, the French government will take its speech, right? So they do a big speech to kind of explain why they've chosen this person and why they matter for France's memory and its national memory. And I'm really not sure. I suspect it will, because so the image I showed you of Baker in her resistance uniform, right? In her uniform, that's the image that the Élysée, the French government chose, right, in making the announcement. And so I think because they're going to focus so much on her role in the French resistance, that this will likely come up, right, as a way to kind of ally her memory to a larger national memory of kind of like being on the right side of World War II. Because there's always, because France had its dual, right, like that dual reality of occupation and resistance, there's going to be the constant attempt to position France you know, in what would be understood to be, you know, the right side of that history. And so I think that that's how the government will likely frame it. But for all of the women that I talked about, I think that Vialle is the person who would perhaps most likely have been involved in a you know, a Black Jewish alliance, particularly because of her experience in the concentration camp and because of the association that she founded. That for her was, you know, was an association that was to bring everyone, right, in France and in overseas France. And so I think she had the most kind of expansive network. And I think maybe if we dig more into her, into sources about her, we'll find some information there. And also in the choice of the people that she collaborated with, right, in the Senate and in her work outside the Senate. But to be honest, yeah, I'm not really sure what spin Emmanuel Macron is going to put on it. So it's the president who makes the speech, right? And I'm not sure what spin he's going to put on that, but I do hope that, you know, that kind of alliance, that kind of relationship will be central in the conversation, because, you know, part of Josephine Baker's legacy is that she brought so many people together, right? She had her, what she called her rainbow tribe, you know, and so because she brought so many people together, I'm hoping that unification kind of, you know, will be at the center of how they remember her.
Okay, and then I'm going to read you the question from the chat, which is a little bit of a complicated question about Suzanne Cezaire's quotes. And Ram Rod asked, what can we learn from her response that we do not speak the same language? In our recent past, this inability to speak the same language led to division that culminated in the mob attacking the Capitol. So I guess the question is, you know, that Suzanne Cezaire was, you know, is her refusal to speak the same language, is there something that's is there a dangerous side to that? I guess is what the audience is asking.
Yeah, I mean, I love the comparison to what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. So I think that to say we do not speak the same language is not the same thing as saying I won't talk to you, right? Or that we will not have a conversation. So I want us to be careful about how we think about the idea of division, right? That we think that sometimes there's a discourse that the opposite of division is that we just all have to come, like, what, let's just all come together and then it's fine, right? But the thing is that it's not fine. There isn't, not all debates are a both sides issue. Not everything is like, both sides carry equal weight, because when one side of the debate is debating whether you deserve to live or die, right? And that's what we see in the present moment. That's what we saw, what we're seeing at the border. That's what we're seeing with Haitian asylum seekers. That's what we saw in the moment of World War II as well, right? It's deciding really who gets to live or die. That in that moment, that it's no longer a question of having a debate on both sides, right? And so, but that's not to say that we don't talk to one another, because Suzanne Cezaire wrote that letter to a fascist government. She didn't say, well, you know what, I'm not even talking to these people. She wrote and explained, and then explained that although I'm talking to you, I'm not talking to you on your terms. That I begin with my definition, right, of how I place myself in this world. That if you call me racist, I place that accusation of racism actually in opposition to the real racism of Hitler, right? And so like you have in that moment, what I find important is taking that language and defining it on your terms. It's a question also of power. So I don't see what Suzanne Cezaire does as kind of equivalent to, what happens on January 6th. I think that there's a particular kind of oversimplification of both sides, that leads to the assumption that we always have to be talking on the terms of somebody who's actually trying to debate whether your existence is valid, right? Let's shift the terms of the debate. We still have the debate, we still have the conversation, but the starting point cannot be, right? Do we, right, like the kind of things that we're being asked to accept in murderous immigration policies, for example. So that's sort of my understanding of Suzanne Cezaire, is what is our starting point in the conversation? Not that we don't have a conversation, but you don't accept just any point of departure as the starting point for the conversation.
Thank you. And I think also what really strikes me about her letter too is that she's looking at it historically. She's not just saying now in 1945, 1940, we don't agree with each other, but look at the whole backwards of French history and how these words have been used and abused. And let's talk about that almost. So she's taking it from a historical and a global perspective, that it might actually be a productive way to approach, how to understand January 6th. By putting it into a different lens, not just in the moment, but in the bigger expanse of history. So we're coming to the end of the talk, and I just wanted to ask if you had any concluding words you might want to say to the students in terms of what you hope they might have gotten out of this this class, this conversation. I don't know, Virginia, do you want to say anything? To end to help sum up what from the class?
I'll bring
And you might need to stand up for a second, actually.
Or maybe we can just put can we put your computer on?
It's very complicated to switch. Yeah, I'll try to switch computers, but I'm not sure it's gonna work. Yeah. Go ahead.
I would say. I would say only to bring to the attention of young people, students, racism and its harm to our well-being.
Thank you. Thank you, Virginia. I'm going to try to switch back to you. Give me 1 second. Annette, if you wanted to say any closing words.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just want to echo what Ms. Allen just said, because I know that I've presented all these women who, were were already kind of established political figures when they undertook their activism. But for all of them, young people were so crucial for their vision for the future, right? And so like Suzanne Cezaire was a teacher. Vialle raised incredible amounts of money to build entire buildings to serve as hostels for students in France. There are buildings in France today that still bear her name, because for her, students and young people were really the ones who were going to be at the forefront of bringing about this future. And so I know that in this short conversation we've had today, you know, there are a lot of complicated ideas that we can't quite, you know, like disentangle and settle in one short conversation, because these are such difficult and painful and complex histories and joint histories that we're thinking about together today. But I'm so hopeful by your presence here. And I hope that, you know, this is a conversation that you all will continue in your classes, that you will continue with me. Please feel free to email me. I'm happy to continue the conversation as well. And that, you know, that young people continue to be the ones who give me the hope for where we're gonna go. And so please continue the conversation and think critically always about what Jeanne Vialle leaves us with, right? What is the work that needs to be done to go from those dark, dreary times to the moment of triumph and equality through knowledge of ourselves. So thank you all so much again for sharing this time and being here with me. And I've just really appreciated this conversation.
And thank you so much on behalf of the Wagner College Holocaust Center and Wagner College. We just really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope all of us will think differently about heroism and who is and who isn't our heroes, and what we can do to live up to their legacy. So thank you so much.
Okay, so Laurie, do you want me to disconnect? What works best for you?
Present my father's story of World War II and the reactions that I got from adults who never knew anyone of color had anything to do with World War II. I can only imagine the reactions that you have been getting in presenting these women. So I'm very, very grateful for your presentation, and hope to hear from you again, and we'll keep track of these stories. It's very important. And as you said, the more informative our youth are about what has happened and the history, the better our future will be.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for being here too.
Dr. Gabriel, what is your reflection on the results of what's been happening since the Floyd incidents in terms of role reversal, racial reversal, the wokeness, and what's happening in America in terms of in the context of what you've spoken about today?
Can I ask you to just clarify for me really quickly what you mean by kind of role reversal?
The image, one of many images I see is that white America is now being forced by the ultra liberal movement, or if you want to use the term woke, that corporate executives and other people have to literally apologize, part of the CRT concept, to apologize to Black people, to others, for being white, for being racist, for being coming from backgrounds of superiority. I mean, as a Jew, as a child of Holocaust survivors, I'm a little incensed about it, because we came here with nothing. We built ourselves up, and not everybody has an equal opportunity, granted. But the way things are being presented and being forced upon the white community at these times, it seems that it's reverse racism. What are your thoughts about that?
Okay. Well, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. Yeah. So I would say that Professor Weintraub's question about the kind of Black-Jewish alliance that you know potentially existed at that time is a really good starting point, right? For us to think about the questions of racism and what it means to exist in a society where there's a racial hierarchy, to think about those questions as structural as opposed to as individual questions, right? So it's not so much a question of like, how should individual people feel or, you know, be guilty or apologize for things, but what does it mean to live in a society that is structured in a certain way such that people are slotted into positions in that structure based on, among other factors, their gender, their racial origins, their national origins, their language, etc., right? And so that when we start thinking in structural terms, then we don't feel, I think, so kind of defensive about something like apologizing for racism. Now, critical race theory doesn't actually ask anybody to apologize for racism, but think about if it did, right? Like, would that be such a terrible thing, considering the impact of racism? Considering, let's take one example, slavery, right? Like, if you had to apologize for that, given the toll and the loss of human life, would that be such a difficult gesture to make, right? That doesn't even begin to redress the balance. It's sort of, you know, so you know, I don't want to make any equivalence with the Holocaust because, you know, these histories are so entangled and complicated. But, you know, let's think about what it means if we shift our focus from, hey, individual white people are being told to feel guilty, to, hey, what does it mean to live in a society that's structured in a certain kind of way? Because, you know, Emmanuel, I don't think that that's something that you disagree with, right? That there's a particular structure in society. And so then what would it mean for us to understand how we begin to dismantle that structure, the way that the four women that I presented today sought to dismantle that structure?